Okay, well, welcome everyone. I am so excited. I've been looking forward to this interview for a good long while, telling my husband about it just the other day that I was getting to interview Ashe in America. And I feel like I know her because I've been reading her writing for quite some time. She writes for for Badlands Media, which is an alternative news source, alternative in terms of not mainstream media. And she is a journalist and breaks down current events. I really enjoy her political commentary that she gives in her daily newsletter. And I was just talking to her. She has a great story, and I'm eager to hear more about it. But thank you, Ashe, and welcome to the Writers Block.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So glad to have you here. And so, why don't you just take a few minutes now and tell us about you, where you're from, kind of how you got started writing and journalism in particular.
Sure. Well, so I'm from Atlanta originally. My family's generation after generation in Atlanta, and I live in Colorado now, and that's interesting. To be in Colorado, there's a lot of news happening in Colorado, but I always wrote. It's I have zero artistic talent, but words were kind of my medium to be creative and expressive from as long as going back to when I first ever was able to write and form sentences. Um, it was always a hobby, right? It's not, not something I went to school to be a journalist. I always wanted to be a journalist, but creative writing, my opinion on things, that felt like, a hobby and not something, not a serious career pursuit. But journalism was a serious career pursuit. And so I went to school in Colorado, CU Boulder, for journalism. I was there when it became a accredited journalism school. I think it was 1998 or 99 when that happened. And by the time I finished journalism school, I I I realized that the news was fake. I my first, and no realizing that the news was fake happened when I was 13. It was the 1992 presidential election.
Hmm.
My parents voted for Perot. And I watched the news ever since I think it was around fourth grade current events type assignments where you're supposed to watch a news story and, like write a paragraph about what it was. I loved the news. I think it made me feel grown up. It made me, more aware of things. And I sort of wanted to be a journalist, but I kind of idolized the news. And then in 1992, my parents voted for Perot, but it wasn't an easy choice for them. They didn't want to throw their vote away. You're going to split the vote, split the ticket, et cetera, et cetera. And they were really struggling with that. And my family debates and we talk about everything. And it was always that way. And my brother and I were a part of those conversations. And when I would watch the news, I saw a very different story. I saw that only idiots would consider throwing their vote away on a third party ticket. And it was hard for me at the time to reconcile it. And that's when I was like, I'm going to get rid of the very naively as a 13-year-old. I'm going to get rid of I'm going to be the objectivity. We have to make news objective again, as though it ever was. And decided to go to journalism school. When I was 15, I wrote my entrance essay. It was, or 16 rather, it was 1995. And my journalism school entrance essay got in everywhere I applied was that headline news would be the downfall of an informed American populace. And I was referring to CNN's headline news, right? The 30-minute show that used to run on a loop where you'd get all the news you needed in 30 minutes. And my thesis was if you convince the population that they can get the truth from a headline, then whoever writes the headline controls the truth. And I thought that was, something we could fix in 1995. And that was we used the card catalog in 1995. It was before mainstream internet. It was certainly
Yeah,
before 240 characters was, the
right,
things that
right.
people reported on. And that 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 was my drive to go into journalism school. On the first day of journalism school, you learn that all of the news is owned by, like, I think at the time it was six corporations, now it's four, and that they're beholden to their advertisers. And that was, it confirmed my concerns going in. By the time I finished college, I decided to go into business because I believed that the news was fake at that point and unfixable, right? The
Mm,
drive to go in and be the change and be objectivity, and that was, you can't do that because your incentive structure is tied to something other than the truth.
mm,
And so I went into business. I was in I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers, did large scale change and communication projects, did a ton of writing in other people's voices, right? Project writing, executive writing, the kind of ghost writer for a lot of executive messaging and that kind of stuff. Transitioned over the course of my career to do more actual change. So that's incorporating communications, but also things like training and leadership alignment, hands-on concierge type services to get people to change their behavior. Really enjoyed it. Great work, mostly large scale technology transformations, getting people to, move from one way of working to another and those kinds of things. And I would write on the side as a hobby. My voice was kind of on the side as a hobby. I think my what was the bit? There was a blog, an early blogging platform. You guys might remember what it was. It started with a B, Blogspot. I got my
I
first,
remember Blogspot. Yeah.
yeah, my first writing was on blog. It's probably out there orphaned somewhere on the internet. I have no idea. But it was a hobby, and really focused on my career, top of my career in November 2020 when the 2020 election happened. And I was already writing a lot about COVID. I never believed in COVID. I don't know if that's controversial in this group, but what I saw was a lot of fear and propaganda being pushed on people to make them change their behavior and comply. And that was my business at the time, was how do you get people to change their behavior? Oftentimes it sticks. They like to do it with carrots if they can, but if they can't get you there with, positive incentives, then there's the use of force and or consequences in some way. And that was what COVID was in my view. It was um, a, a practice in authoritarianism that was widely driven through fear. You're going to die. There's the counter of how many people are dying every single day. And then when not enough people were dying, it switched to cases. And there's so many cases every single day. And it was this push to make everybody afraid. You can't go outside anymore because of a virus. We don't want sunlight? No, we don't. When you have to stay away from your family. Those things to me felt like propaganda, and they were very effective. My elderly parents were terrified of me.
Hmm.
My mom's immune compromised and absolutely terrified. They came around and, early on, and by the time of the election, I think most of the people in my circle were skeptical that what started with 2 weeks to slow the spread was still going, and that we were losing our rights, we were losing our freedom of association and assembly, our freedom of speech. Many of us were censored for questioning the government response to COVID, and that was a kind of a awakening for me in terms of I can't just focus on my career anymore. Like I have to actually use my voice in this because so many people that I considered to be, really intelligent, capable professionals, very skilled, very credentialed people were terrified of a virus. And that was it was bizarre. I was never tested for COVID. I wouldn't let them stick that thing up my nose because I don't trust the government that hard. And then the election happened. And the projects that I was working on at the time, I'm working in the changing the behavior part of the projects, but the projects themselves were large scale technology transformations. And I had concentration in cloud. I think my cloud thought leadership paper is still up on aws.com, but it's kind of a niche subject matter specialist as it pertained to people and behavior in the cloud world specifically. How do you get your engineering and development teams to be more efficient, to be more effective, those kinds of projects. And in that role, I had a lot of exposure to technology. So I did a ton of AWS training classes. I was actually teaching some of them. And these are, there's a security concentration in all of these disciplines. And they're just things in working adjacent, not a technologist, but adjacent to technologists, really, really smart people for years. There are things that technologists and security professionals don't say. They don't say, it's impossible to be hacked. They don't say safest and most secure ever. They don't say things like that because there's an incredible amount of liability attached to that. But in the wake of the election, when there were real questions about the technology that was being used in the election, that was the response that we got from the authorities in cybersecurity. And that was, to me, absolutely not. And here's the thing, we can tolerate government overreach if there is a pandemic and we have to for public health, right? We can tolerate those things because we believe that we've elected people to represent our interests and that they're going to work together to protect those interests and above all protect our rights. They swear an oath to that bit. That's what's going to drive, and that's why we trust things like if they have a response in a pandemic. If the election itself, in which we choose our representation, if that's not legitimate, if it's undermined, if it's compromised, if it's able to be manipulated, and you're not allowed to ask questions about it, then our representation becomes very much in question. And that was kind of the moment that I had in 2020 and I was watching, this is coincident with COVID, right? I was watching my clients track people's vaccination status in spreadsheets offline. This would have been unthinkable before COVID because of HIPAA and because of all sorts of liability that people would be terrified, companies would be terrified of wading into. All of a sudden it was okay. All of a sudden it was okay to violate all of the standards and all of the norms. And that to me was not okay. And so when the election thing happened, I had this existential moment and I started marching and I started researching everything I could. Met up with other people that felt the same way that I did with different concentrations. So, retired U.S. Air Force colonel who tested critical infrastructure for the Department of Defense. He started reading all of the election vendor manuals to understand their testing landscape and how do they test these systems, because that's his concentration, right? If you talk to a surgeon, they're always going to try and cut something, right? Like his thing. I'm always going to see people and behavior and the ecosystems of people and behavior because that's where I spend my time. We brought together this really interesting group and it just happened. I think a lot of it was a God thing. Just happened that people with very complementary but very different skill sets came together to try to figure out what was true with our elections. And I'm rambling on, so please stop me if you want, if I'm
It's fascinating.
okay. So we pulled together this group. We called it the U.S. Election Integrity Plan. We never raised a penny. We didn't incorporate or create any sort of entity. We weren't trying to build some sort of structure. The hypothesis was every conservative or libertarian or, adjacent type of group in the wake of 2020 is going to try and figure out what's going on with our elections. Everybody should talk to each other. That was the premise. We should share information on what we're finding and talk to each other. And we did that in Colorado, and we ended up with people in all 64 counties that were looking at their county landscape and, what are the county clerks and commissioners saying, what are our contracts look like? What are the specifics of the vendor landscapes and all these kinds of things? And we talked to each other. In the spring of 2021, several counties decided that they wanted to canvass. They wanted to go check the record. We're going to knock on doors and say, this is what the record says. Is this true? The turnout records. So the government says that you voted in person on this date. Is that true? The government says that you returned a mail-in ballot. Here in Colorado, we have all mail-in ballots. So we did that. Groups around the in 4 counties, all volunteer, all self-driven. We knocked 10,000 doors. Again, never raised a penny. The methodology was designed by data scientists and peer reviewed by statisticians and mathematicians. The training of canvassers was designed by a volunteer who was a corporate trainer, and she had like that whole skill set to bring. Um, and that was kind of how our thing worked. It was like, people brought their skill set to the table to figure out what was true in elections. So we knocked almost 10,000, it's like 9,400 something doors. We found, and because of the methodology and the target thresholds, we found that 8 to 11% of the official turnout records were inaccurate or at least anomalous. Somebody received and returned a mail-in ballot from a storage unit or an Arby's or a intersection. Hundreds and hundreds of examples across like 8 different categories of anomalies. When we found an anomaly, we got a sworn affidavit. All of that information was provided to the authorities saying, hey, here's a problem. This should be looked into. About 2 days before we released our report, we were sued by the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and Mi Familia Vota for these are all Get Out the Vote organizations for voter suppression, intimidation, coercion, and threats under the Voting Rights Act and the KKK Act. And they filed their lawsuit and they brought it to the AP and it went out on the wire and everyone picked it up. We found out we were being sued from the press and that our names were attached to the KKK from the press. It was like 10 days later that we were actually served with the lawsuit and able to read it. It was 2.5 years of litigation. We went to trial last July. We won on a 52C motion because everything they said about us was false. They
Hmm.
said we were sending armed agents to minorities' homes to interrogate them about their voting records and that they had personal knowledge that people were actually intimidated and all of these lies, I mean, straight up lies under pain and penalty of perjury that they told to the court. They weren't able to bring even the judge said in her final judgment, which was 52C, which means we won at halftime. We didn't have to bring our defense case in chief because they didn't have a case. They weren't able to produce what the judge said, anything even remotely considering intimidation. The key moment at trial was they had this one witness that they said was totally canvassed by us and was intimidated. And at trial, she admitted that she never knew anything about us, had never heard of us. It was the plaintiff's attorneys that told her to name us, which actually kept the case going for like a year and a half. So through that
So
process,
when
yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, was it through that? Because it seems like, I mean, you've been burned a little bit with this whole process. I mean, you were suspicious where you smelled smoke, you knew there was probably fire, and then you got involved and were also experiencing some of that. I don't know, to carry the metaphor that this you were seeing smoke and other coming from other places. And so was that when, I mean, you made that transition from being in that behavioral realm to being involved in like the journalism aspect of this, or was that all already coinciding with the work that you were doing?
So the journalism thing, I mean, I was telling you this a little bit before we started. I really think it's a God thing. So, it's full circle. So through this process, I'm in management consulting. Consulting is a relationship-based business, and my consulting was in the local Denver business community. When your name is attached to the KKK, your work dries up real quick. I basically lost that 20 years that I had built. It was gone relatively quickly. It wasn't overnight. It was about 6 months. People look at you sideways when they first see it, and you think like, I'm going to fight this. I have rights. They can't defame me this way. And then the process keeps going, and the court rules in their favor a couple of times on things, and people start, really questioning, what did you do? Like my own husband was like, you must have done something. And we didn't. nothing even remotely considered intimidating. We just asked the wrong questions. We asked questions that you weren't allowed to ask. You're not allowed to question elections. You're undermining democracy if you question elections. But here's the thing, guys. What if elections are questionable? What the First Amendment says we absolutely are allowed to question. So I lost all of that. We lived on our savings for a little while, and writing first and then podcasting became a necessity. It stopped being a hobby. It stopped being something that I did, when I had time, and as sort of fun and as an outlet, and it turned into the way that I earn a living and support my family. And that's been such the incredible journey with God. One thing I didn't mention is in the trial, I defended myself. It's Federal District Court of Colorado. I had attorneys up till the eve of trial, and they were like, "You need to settle." And I was like, "What? There's no evidence, and they're lying about me." And then they said, "Okay, well, if you really want to go to trial, then you're going to need to give us $50,000 more dollars." And I was like, "Okay, you're fired. I'm gonna figure this out." So learned the law, and that experience, I got real comfortable with it being me and God. The trial itself, I kind of it's like an out of body experience. It's like, I can look back on it, and it's like I was watching somebody else go through this insane, incredible thing. I was cross-examining witnesses, right? I'm not an attorney. Like change manager, right? But that it was wild, and when I fired them, we got a continuance. And so I had like 6 months to learn the rules, learn the law, learn the case law specific to my case, and, be able to go in with a plan to deal with trial. It was about 10 witnesses total at the trial. And I was a little bummed actually that when we got the 52C judgment, because I had a whole defense planned. And
Like I didn't get a chance to
yeah,
cross-examine. Yeah.
yeah, but it was, getting really, really comfortable in that space with, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't feel adequate at all to do this. But this is the position that I'm in. And looking back at kind of the macro arc, and where was God in this, right? When you look back, you can see God's hand. And like, it was clear that I was supposed to be doing this. And my defense was the First Amendment, that I said under oath in federal court, I believe the elections are stolen. And I know that that's an offensive statement to a lot of people. I get the hate mail. I read a local column in Colorado. I get a lot of hate mail about my opinions on elections. But we should all be protecting our right to speak, our right to say what we believe to be true. And I really believe that our elections are manipulated. I believe that because of years of research and practice and in the field validation. And I don't expect anybody to just believe me. I think that people can go and look, but at no point, like, I would never say that people that say our elections aren't manipulated should have their voice taken. I would never say that people that are very passionate about a certain COVID treatment shouldn't be allowed to talk about it. That's anti-American. And it's our First Amendment is fundamental to protecting religious speech. It's fundamental for us to be able to say what we believe to be true. And, depending on where you are in the country, you might experience your religious speech being very much under attack. That's the case here in Colorado. They just passed a bill here that misgendering someone can lead to you having your kids taken. And it's a wild time to be alive, but through the process I ended up, kind of back where I started in the fourth grade, loving the news, and trying to be objective about what's true in the news. And it's impossible for humans to be entirely objective. We bring our own biases and perspectives and everything to it. But when it comes to reporting news, I really try to be factual. I'm reporting the Mike Lindell case right now, and I know a lot of the people involved in the case. I'm trying to straight report what's happening in the courtroom, and it's a full circle thing, which is kind of cool.
So when you went through that whole experience of having to go defend your name, by yourself. I mean, that's really incredible. Um, I hear in what you're saying is that you see it's like a God thing, like the Lord was moving you through that experience. When you look back on that, I mean, having to go through all of that time and expense eventually to be vindicated, praise God that you were, but did you ever feel real embittered towards that whole process, or do you really look back on it with gratefulness because it kind of opened up this new pathway for you in journalism?
So throughout the process, both, right? Now I mean I see it. I see that like if this and this might sound crazy to some people, but if it hadn't gone this way, I don't think I ever would have left corporate America. It was too scary, it was too comfortable. It was, the benefits and the security of it. I have three sons. It was very safe safe place to be. And I was always outspoken, conservative Christian in my workplace and very liberal workplaces. I've always been surrounded by people that don't think like me. This is probably the most echo chambery my life has ever been, to be honest, is doing conservative journalism because I was always in environments with people that didn't think like my best friend is a leftist. Um, but the looking back, I know myself and I know that God was telling me to write for years, and it was like, yeah, I will. I will when I have time. I'm very busy, don't you know? And so I don't know that I would have gotten to where he wanted me if it hadn't gone this way. And there's a real thing to being refined through fire, right? When you face trials, right?
Literally,
Okay.
literal trials. Yeah.
Yeah. So that I'm super grateful. I'm excited for what God has next. I've really learned to get very comfortable with just it being me and God, right? And
Yeah.
like this is what we're doing. But I will tell you, like through the process, there was a lot of moments of bitterness. There's also times I was in the fetal position on the floor. I mean, my career was everything to me, and in like it was gone and I had to mourn it because you can't go back. You can't go back to a relationship based business built on trusted relationships when with, folks in a very small community. Denver is, considered it's a big city, but it's a small business community. And when when, when people believe that you're attached to the clan, there's like two people out of hundreds that will still return my phone calls, and that's really hard to swallow because
Yeah.
I didn't do anything differently. I didn't change. I was always conservative and Christian. And I was always able to speak that out and to live. To live how I believe and to be able to assert the things that I believe until we faced that season of first COVID and then the election where all of a sudden we were censored. All of a sudden our health status was tracked by our employer, right? Like things that would have been unthinkable prior to that. All of a sudden I was, you know, kind of like I didn't change. Like all of you changed. Like
Yeah.
I didn't change. And that that was really hard. And it's hard not even still sometimes to be a little bit bitter about that.
So how did that lead you to Badlands Media? I don't know if anyone here is familiar with them, but that's how I first encountered your writing. And I too had, I mean, not a similar journey, but I was kind of awakening to the fakeness of news during COVID, and I was finding alternative news because I knew the news was fake. And I came in contact with Badlands, first of all, through Patel Patriot. If any of you want to go down that rabbit hole with me, I'd love to share with you, maybe on another call. But how did you wind up with them? And could you tell us a little bit about that group and kind of like the scope of what you guys do?
Sure. So Badlands Media was started by Patel Patriot's John Harold. He was writing a Substack called Devolution, and it was very popular. It talks about continuity of government. and relies on primary sources. So it's executive orders and presidential emergency action documents, and it's, John's focus is always on, show me what's true, show me the receipts, show me the documents. So he was doing that. I had no idea who he was at the time. But I met CanCon, the cannabis conservative Brian Lupo, at the cyber symposium, the Mike Lindell cyber symposium. And he and I became friends. His podcast was actually the first podcast I ever did about a piece that I wrote on, I think it was the Maricopa audit, was that piece.
I'm in Maricopa, and I
Yeah.
actually was part of the audit.
Yeah.
Interesting. I was
Yeah,
counting
well, I'd,
ballots,
I'd love
but
to talk to you about that sometime. So I met Brian, and Brian and I, we're both very much focused on elections and not really any other kind of news at the time. And so we, became friends and started sharing information and, reporting. He's joined Badlands. And at the time that Brian joined Badlands was when I learned what Badlands was. And then a few months later, it was March, late February or early March of 2023, John reached out to me and said, I've followed your reporting for a while now, and well, I think you're one of us, and I think you should come, join Badlands. And he was like, you need your own show. And at the time, I'm like, well, I don't do shows. Like I'll go on as a guest on a show, which I'd done like four times at that point. Um, but that's not, I'm not a broadcast journalist. I'm a print journalist. Like that was kind of my reaction to it. But he was very adamant about it, and I now do several shows. And it's a lot more natural, but it was pretty nerve-wracking at the time. And it I'm it kind of saved my life in a lot of ways in the physical world, right? The collaboration of hosts at Badlands, we are all different, and we don't all have the same belief structures. Some people are Christian, some people are Catholics, some people are, Protestant Christians, some people are Catholics, some there's people that are atheists, people that are more agnostic, some spiritual folks. And we're not all even, like conservative. I think we're all Trump supporters. We see that this I believe in this again. You see a surgeon, they're going to tell you that you need to have surgery, right? I see what we're going through now. I say we're going through a transformational change program that's moving the people and changing their behavior, because that's my orientation. It's what I see. I think we all kind of see that there is something happening here that is um, moving us in a away from globalism, away from kind of sacrificing American greatness so that every other nation can rise, away from forever wars and the massive amount of funding and foreign aid and all of these things that the American people are on the hook for, but we don't really have a say in, right? You poll most people on the wars, and they don't want to be in them, but we don't really get a say when it comes down to that. I think all of us at Badlands see that there is this transitional period going. Trump calls it the golden age that we're heading into. Other people see the emerging technology landscape and the energy solutions that are coming down. Great podcast for folks to watch is Sean Ryan's podcast with General Steve Quast. It was a couple weeks ago. Steve Quast is a friend of mine. He's an incredible man of faith, man of God. He is a lieutenant general that retired out of Space Force, and he now is the CEO of a space technology company called Space Build. And he went on Sean Ryan, and I mean they run the gamut. He always brings glory and honor to the Most High God. General Quast does, but I highly recommend that. But there's a lot. We're on the precipice of transformational change in a way that's going to be undeniable. And I mean that very much in like the technologies, the processes, the transformation happening within departments of government. the people voted for change in 2024, and you're not going to have meaningful change unless you actually change things. You have to, change the institutions and transform them. And I think we see that happening. That's a big part of what we talk about on Badlands, but that takes different domains, right? There's a health concentration with people like Jordan Sather, who talks about hidden cures and the technologies and medication landscapes around health and what might health look like in the future in the golden age. There's a show on Monday nights called Baseless Conspiracies, which goes through all of the conspiracies. And John Patel Patriot is very much a skeptic, and Zach is like a conspiracy theorist. So it's Zach trying to convince John of, whatever this conspiracy theory is, kind of thing. Brian Lupo and I do a show called Why We Vote on Friday nights, and we talk about what's the reality about elections, what has been found, what are the CISA statements, and the EAC landscape. What is David Becker over at the Center for Election Integrity and Center for Election Information and Research? What is he talking about? President Trump issued an election integrity executive order. What does that mean? How does that impact the downstream systems and vendor landscapes? And so that's what we dig into on that show. And there's a lot of shows like that. And then we also just have kind of straight news shows. I mean, it's straight news in terms of, as the world as we see it. We're all sort of irreverent. My friend Chris Paul, who goes by I'm Your Moderator and has a podcast called Be Reasonable. He talks about the party of false decorum and how the speech codes and kind of this, be nice to everybody and, be respectful in every instance and every interaction, that actually suppresses a lot of pushback and criticism in our at a time when things should be pushed back on and we should be critical of them. And so we kind of break out of that mold. It's we all pick on each other. It's kind of our love language. There's two women. Oh, we're actually getting more now. So Shipwreck Show joined us on Wednesday nights, and she does her show. And Abby Blue Eyes, she goes by. She's my co-host on a couple of shows. But I'm usually in a group of dudes. Lucky me, I grew up with brother and I had a very strong father. I spent 20 years in a male dominated industry. I have three sons and I'm a wife. So
Yeah,
I feel like
you're
I can hang with a
you're
group of dudes.
you've been made capable to do that. What I really enjoy about I think a 5 day a week newsletter that I get from you is they do headlines and pull stories straight from their news source, and then there's an hour take at the bottom, and I really appreciate that because it does help you kind of look at news a little bit more discerningly,
Mhm.
to see some different perspectives. So if any one of you are interested in that, we'll provide the link to that in the show notes. But so Ash, when you're looking and you do a lot of writing political commentary, how do you go about that? Tell us a little bit about your process. How much research are you doing into a story? I mean, you've talked about a few of the topics like election integrity. Um, I was really encouraged. Well, and that's, I don't even know the right word for it, but you had written quite a bit about a lot of the transgenderism issues, and I just really appreciated your take on those things as a Christian woman looking at the landscape of those things. So are you writing about certain topics that are near and dear to your heart? Or are you being assigned certain things and having to do a bunch of research? Like, what does that look like for you? Because
That's a,
the news is changing like moment by moment. So I'm sure that's a task.
Yeah, it's a great question. I like the way you frame that question. So, nobody assigns us stories at Badland. We talk about the things that we want to talk about, the things that are important to us, and that's kind of how the collection of Badland shows and the collection of takes in the newsletter each morning. That's how those things come together. Is it's what is it that that we think is important. For me, that's usually having to do with elections, having to do with faith and religious freedom, or having to do with children.
Mm.
I am horrified by what I see as there was, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there was a pride parade a couple years ago where they were chanting, "We're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children." And then there was the gay men's choir that did the "We'll convert your children." And people are like, "Oh, it's just a troll. They're just joking." But they're not. And I'll point you to Colorado, where there is a approach to normalize minor attracted people, where there is a prioritization of social sciences over actual sciences, and that presents in transgenderism, but it also presents in other ways. I personally believe that transgenderism is Baphomet worship. I believe that it's based upon a premise that God made a mistake and put you in the wrong body, and you need to take surgical intervention and medical intervention to correct God's mistake. And I have, I don't form opinions to your question about research. I don't form strong opinions until I've done what I feel like is, I've done all of the research, right? I haven't read every paper, but I've read the different domains of points of view and what their evidence points are and come to. So I'll give you an example. My position on transgenderism has evolved in that when I was working in corporate America, I had several transgender colleagues, known them and loved them as members of my community and called them friends. Never did I see any overt focus on children. The people that were in my community, I didn't see that, and that was across work and other social, kids sports teams and whatnot. People walk among us. Um, what has happened in, I would say, the past 3 to 4 years is that the members of that community that are trying to live authentically and live their lives are drowned out by an outsized focus on children. And they'll use adult transgenders to make their case for why they need to approach children. Well, if I had just been allowed to transition earlier, then I wouldn't have been so suicidal. I wouldn't have had, these problems. My appearance would have been more in line with my preferred gender because I was taking the hormones earlier. So we have to allow kids to do these things because the adult transgenders tell us that it'll make their transgender experience had they been allowed to access the care when they were children. That is a concerning proposition because children can't consent. Children children's brains don't finish forming until they're 25 years old, but certainly if we're not going to let a child get a piercing or a tattoo, we shouldn't be allowing them to take a medication that is going to impact their fertility for the rest of their lives. I think that's immoral, and I think that the shying away of people of God from addressing that issue has allowed it to get to where it is. And that's one of I write a lot and talk a lot about the Western church has dropped the ball, in my opinion, when it comes to being the body of Christ. The They've abandoned the public square and it's filled with government. The social services, the welfare state, the services that everybody has come to rely upon the government providing those services. It was not that long ago that wasn't a need for government because it was filled by the church. It was filled by the people of God. And now, and we saw this most pronouncedly in COVID, the church prioritizes its tax status and not getting in trouble with the government over being the hands and feet of Jesus in their communities. And we see that over and over again. And it's why the government has creeped into so many areas that the government has absolutely no place being. I think that the church bears a lot of that responsibility. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. Yeah, those are heavy topics, and a lot is plays into those things. But I appreciate your voice being lent to that subject, and I think it's needed. And like you said, where there's a vacuum, something will fill it. And so I think Christians, it's important for Christians to be in that public square, speaking
Yeah.
truth into that. And so I really appreciate what you're doing, Ash. I think it's really brave. And you're up against a monster in many cases, and a machine as well. Um, we're kind of at that point in our interview where I have more questions to ask you, but we're also kind of nearing the end. So I just want to give the ladies on the call an opportunity to unmute, ask any questions. I mean, I think Ash is a very articulate woman who can answer questions about politics, writing, journalism, all of the above. So if y'all have any questions, I want to give you an opportunity to ask those.
Hi, Ash. I'm curious to know how you balance what you do and your faith without growing cynical. There are, for a while there, I would listen to the Daily Wire, and because I agreed with what they were saying, but it got to the point where I did not agree or like how the way they said it, the way they say things. And I understand that as Christians, we need to be separate. We can't, like you said, just be nice about everything. There are times when we need to push back. How do you do that and balance that without first becoming bitter and cynical yourself, and second, with still showing some grace of the Lord, but yet but holding to the truth? Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. I don't know that I'm super good at it. I am a little bit cynical. Well, I'm a lot cynical when I look at the state of the world, and particularly the 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 talking points isn't the right word. The focus of the Christian movement, right? The churches, the national Christian spokespeople. Um, I am a little bit cynical about it. I think that it's lukewarm. I think that God spits it out because I think we're supposed to be bold, and particularly in a period of time when we are seeing God be mocked in our institutions. We're on the hook for that. Our communities, we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it, and we're supposed to be his hands and feet. And so I am cynical about that. I will say that I just have so much joy because I see I mean, I don't totally see what God is doing. Nobody can, but like you can see his hand. You can see the way that God is moving things. So I'm very, I guess the one, like, I don't have a Christian podcast. I'm very concerned about the trying to be a representative, right? Trying to for people to look at me and see that I'm different and I have something different and they want that, versus using the name of God to build your own kingdom. And I think what I see in most of the mainstream rhetoric coming out of, like Christian podcasters or Christian writers is, and not, not everyone, obviously, but like the net effect of it is using the name of God to build their own kingdoms. And that is, I think it's offensive to God, and I don't ever want to be that. Now, I am not perfect. Kara will tell you, we curse on bad hands. Like we talk about the ideas the way that we hear them. I also talk about God. When I see the hand of God in something, I will say it. I will, when God does a thing, I will give him glory, honor, and praise. And I'm never going to shy away from that. I talked about my faith under oath in federal court. I'll talk about my faith to anybody that comes within the sound of my voice or or the reading my words. um I I think about, the way that, because the core of your question, right, is like kind of how do we keep nice? How do we stay, we want to show people Jesus, um but we don't want to cross any lines. We don't want to offense. We don't want to become a stumbling block for people, right? We want to be, I think God wants us to be bold. And I think when you look at Deborah, or you look at the Proverbs 31 woman, I mean, the Proverbs 31 woman was not a housewife that stroked her husband all day. She was a merchant and a businesswoman and a seamstress, and she fed her family, and she taught all of her children, and she made sure she did all of it to make sure that her husband could sit at the gate and worship the Lord and do what he was supposed to be doing. And that's the message of the Proverbs 31 woman to me, but that's not the message that I was taught by the Christian church when I was growing up. I was taught that she was a submissive housewife. And that is, I think, a perversion. I think God wants us to be bold. I think he wants us and God has all of us. He created us with specific talents and gifts, and he placed us in our circumstances with our specific purpose and mission. I fully believe that. For some of us, that means walking into the fire and speaking boldly in the midst of the fire. That's what it meant for Paul. It's what it meant for John the Baptist, right? Um, and we all have different gifts. And so I think trying to stay trying to stay in the center of God's will. There's this concept in the screw tape letters where the elder demon is talking to his nephew, and he was asked about this putrid fog that's surrounding the patient, and what do I do about that? And the older demon is like, well, there's not really anything you can do about that. That's the most potent, powerful weapon that they have against us, but if you just wait a little bit, it'll dissipate, and then you can get at them again. I think that what they're referring to in that, what C.S. Lewis was referring to in that, is being in the center of the Holy Spirit, being filled with the Holy Spirit and operating and acting out of the Holy Spirit. And if you are trying to follow God's will and do what God is calling you to do, they can't touch you. There's nothing that can happen to you that he doesn't allow. And so believing that and being bold about it, I think that's half the battle. And then there's the grace part, right? Like you said, like, how do we show the grace of the Lord? That's hard sometimes, especially in, the political kind of realm and activism, on the ground organizing realm. There's a lot of knives you pull out of your back. And how do you show the grace of the Lord when that happens? What does turn the other cheek actually look like in practice? Well, for me, it was, being attacked by people that I really respected and loved, and being lied about, and God telling me, don't defend yourself. Don't do anything. You have to let this happen. And I had to trust the Lord in that. And it was one of the hardest things that I had to do, because I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to say, oh, this isn't true. Why are you saying these things about me? And it was very clear to me that God said, no, let this happen. And that has proven out to be like, oh, okay, so that's why that happened over time. But in the moment, it's really difficult. I'd say that, Cheryl, to your question, the answer is you got to trust God. You've got to just, stay focused on the goal. What is the purpose of life? Well, fully believe the purpose of life is to bring glory and honor to the Most High God. We're put here with all of these distractions in a world full of temptations, and he gives us free will, and he wants us to choose him. And he wants us to recognize him as sovereign, and he wants us to operate out of that and try to live a life that brings him glory.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. And I think too, like, I think when one thing that's interesting too is, like, I'm sure you see this and experience this as you're reporting and then opening up your New Testament, you can kind of see how there's like nothing new under the sun. You
Mhm.
see how Jesus encountered the religious Pharisees during his walk on earth, and the same lies and the same gaslighting. Really, we didn't have a
Yeah.
word for it until the last 5 years, but that's exactly what they were doing. They were calling good evil and evil good, And you see that more and more. I mean, I think when you have eyes to see that, you see it in everything. It just really kind of lifts the veil on how to interpret the world around us. And the Holy Spirit is the one that gives us the eyes to see that. Um,
Absolutely.
but yeah, that's a good question, Cheryl. And I think it must be hard because you do get to see some of the worst, being out there, out front and center.
Yeah, I think being angry for the right reasons too, right? It's easy to get wrapped up in the rhetoric and the mudslinging, and in my, but in the kind of political and social zeitgeist realm, like it's easy to get distracted by things that are in fact distractions, and that's one of the things that I try to, like, it's kind of the daily walk, thankful that the mercies are new every morning, because by the end of the day I've racked up a debt, right? And but yeah, I mean, one of the things I learned, I said, I've gotten comfortable with it being me and God. The one thing that I learned, and I know beyond anything else, is that my job is to show up, and He will do the rest. If I show up, and I will, be in the be in the right orientation, showing up for the right reason, because God's telling me to, and because I want to honor Him. When I show up, God does the rest every time.
Yeah, that's a beautiful walk of faith for sure. Well, Ash, where can we follow you? Where's the best place to engage with your work?
So I'm on all of the social media platforms at Ashe in America, ASHE in America. The only one that I really use regularly, and engage with more than just posting like my show content and whatnot, is X. And I just can't balance more than one. It's
Yeah, you gotta
each one,
kind of
each
pick
one is
one.
like a different world, you know.
It
It's
is,
and
yeah.
but all of my content is indexed on my link tree, so linktree.com/Ash in America. And then Badlands Media is where most of that is. I also run the Colorado Free Press, so for anybody in Colorado, coloradofreepress.com. And I write for the Glendale Cherry Creek Chronicle, write a monthly column in that
Hmm.
paper as well here in Colorado. But Badlands Media is the national stuff. That's badlandsmedia.tv or Badlands Media on Rumble or X.
Yeah, awesome.
Oh, and
Well,
Substack is where the writing is. Badlands.
yeah, that's where you can subscribe,
Yeah.
is on Substack. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Well, this has been really interesting, engaging, and like very relevant information. So I appreciate you lending your voice here on the podcast. And we thank you for the work that you're doing, Ash. It's been really great to meet you and hear more about what you do.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. You guys have a great day.